The snow fell sideways that morning like ash from a dead world. Barbed wire moaned in the wind, its frozen spirals glinting under a sun that never warmed. Inside Stalag VIIIC, a camp built from timber, mud, and hopelessness, the prisoners stirred to the clang of a bell hammered on a rusted brake drum. Boots scraped across frostbitten earth as men formed lines, ghosts wrapped in tattered British khaki and Polish coats stripped from the fallen. The smell of coal smoke and unwashed wool thickened the air, and in one trembling hand, hidden beneath a crust of snow, was a scrap of paper that should have been destroyed, a letter written in secret, its ink diluted with melted snow and blood from cracked knuckles. Every word risked a beating or worse. But he wrote anyway, his pencil trembling as he whispered each sentence under his breath as though saying them out loud might keep them alive, because this was not just a letter. It was proof that inside these fences where names became numbers and hope was contraband, one man still believed his voice could reach home. And somehow, against every regulation, every guard, every German censor trained to shred forbidden words, it did. It slipped through the wire, through hands that should have burned it, through an empire of silence, and landed on a kitchen table in England, stained with snow, smelling faintly of smoke and iron. When the authorities read it, they said nothing for a long time. Then one whispered, "This should never have made it out." The paper shook in his hands, because on that torn page, beneath the censor's ink and military stamps, was a truth no one was meant to see. The wind that morning didn't whistle. It screamed. It clawed through the gaps in the barrack walls, carrying flakes that burned like splinters of glass when they struck exposed skin. In the eastern reaches of Silesia, winter was an enemy of its own kind, merciless, indiscriminate, and hungrier than the men trapped behind wire. Stalag VIIIC, once a lumber depot, had been repurposed into a machine for patience and despair. Rows of huts, each sagging under the weight of snow, lined the yard like exhausted soldiers at attention. The fences groaned as ice thickened around the barbs. Beyond them, the dark outline of the forest hinted at freedom so close it mocked those who dared to dream. Inside Block 12, the stoves had gone out hours before dawn. Frost spread over the wooden bunks like a second layer of paint. Men slept pressed against each other for warmth. Britons from the 51st Highland Division, Poles from the defense of Warsaw, a handful of French aviators shot down over the Ardennes. Rank meant nothing here. Hunger was the only uniform they all shared. When the bell sounded, an iron disc beaten with a wrench, the hut stirred with the dull rhythm of survival. Boots scraping, coughs cracking through the air, someone whispering a prayer that smelled of disbelief. Among them sat Corporal Thomas Hale, number 4346, a 26-year-old dispatch rider from Dorset. Before the war, he had worked in a post office, sorting letters bound for towns he'd never seen. Now, in a twist of cruelty that felt scripted by fate, he was the man trying to send a letter from the one place no mail was supposed to leave. His hands, raw and scarred from weeks of labor on the rail spur outside the camp, trembled as he cupped them over a tiny scrap of newspaper torn from a Red Cross parcel. It wasn't paper made for ink, it bled instantly, but it was all he had. And he had a message that refused to stay inside him any longer. He waited until the guards passed. The Lagerführer, Hauptmann Müller, made his rounds like a ghost in a greatcoat, eyes sharp behind fogged spectacles. He rarely spoke. His whistle did the talking. Two guards trailed him, rifles slung, boots sinking into slush. When their steps faded beyond the barrack, Hale pulled from his sleeve the stub of a pencil he'd hidden inside the lining. He sharpened it against a nail protruding from the bunk frame. The men around him pretended not to see. In Stalag VIIIC, seeing too much could get you sent to the Strafblock. He began to write, slowly, painfully, the graphite dragging over damp paper. "My dearest Margaret." The words looked wrong in that frozen air, too tender to survive among so much ruin, but once he started, the sentences poured out as though the act itself could thaw him. He wrote about the snow, about how it muffled even the sound of gunfire from the front. He wrote about the way the men still sang at night, soft songs of home that made the guards listen through the walls. He wrote that he was alive. He lied about food, said they had soup every day. He lied about warmth, said the barrack stove burned all night. What he didn't lie about was hope. He wrote, "We will come home, Maggie. The world can't stay this cruel forever." When his hand cramped, he stopped and breathed into his fingers until they moved again. Outside, a siren wailed, the signal for roll call. He folded the paper once, twice, then pressed it flat beneath his tunic. He would find a way. He had to. He'd seen a Polish orderly trade letters with a German medic for cigarettes. He'd heard rumors of a sympathetic interpreter who smuggled messages through the parcels office. Somewhere in the machinery of control there were cracks, and Hale meant to slip through one. The parade ground was a frozen sea of mud glazed with ice. Columns formed under the eyes of machine gun towers. Guards shouted names that were no longer names but numbers barked from clipboards. Hale stood in line beside Sergeant Wojtek Nowak, a Polish artilleryman with eyes the color of gunmetal. They had dug the rail trench together for 3 weeks, trading language through gestures and shared exhaustion. Nowak nodded at Hale's shivering hands and whispered in broken English, "You write again?" Hale hesitated. "Just a few words." Nowak's grin was tired but kind. "Good, words are fire. Keep them burning." The roll call dragged for an hour. Men fainted, boots slipped, and still the guards counted, miscounted, and started over. By the time they were dismissed to the work detail, the sun was only a pale smudge behind a veil of cloud. Hale and Nowak marched east toward the Oder River, where the prisoners hauled timber for the rail embankment. The snow there was mixed with soot from locomotives that screamed past like beasts too wild to cage. Every whistle was a reminder that the world outside still moved, still mattered. At midday, the guards allowed a rest. The men sat on logs eating frozen bread that cracked like wood. Hale used the moment to test his plan. Near the tool wagon stood Unteroffizier Keller, a young guard with a limp from Stalingrad. Keller smoked constantly. His gloved fingers yellowed from nicotine. The rumor was he took English cigarettes in exchange for favors, small ones. Hale approached cautiously, holding out half a bar of chocolate saved from a parcel. "Frau Keller," he said in halting German, "for your wife." Keller squinted, then laughed through his cigarette smoke. "You think I have wife after Stalingrad?" "Only ghost, Tommy." Hale smiled faintly, slipping the folded letter from his pocket. "Then for her ghost," he murmured. "Just make sure this finds England." The guard's eyes narrowed. For a moment, Hale thought he'd gone too far. But Keller took the paper, sniffed the chocolate, and tucked both into his coat. "Maybe," he said. "If paper not dangerous, if not. Propaganda." He walked away, leaving Hale staring after him, heartbeat echoing in the hollow space of his chest. That night, Hale lay awake, listening to the wind scratch the walls. Every creak of boots outside felt like judgment. He imagined Keller being searched, the letter found, his own body dragged into the snow. Yet beneath the fear there was a strange calm. The words were gone from him now, carried by another. Whatever happened next was out of his control. He whispered a line from the letter, "Love is the only thing they can't ration." Then, for the first time in weeks, he slept without nightmares. 2 days later, chaos swept the camp. A prisoner had been caught with contraband, a radio fragment hidden inside a loaf of bread. The Feldgendarmerie arrived. Dogs straining on leashes, shouts splitting the morning quiet. Barracks were searched, bunks overturned, men beaten for things they didn't own. Hale's heart froze as Keller's voice rose outside, protesting. Through a crack in the wall, Hale saw him standing before Miller, hands raised, the color drained from his face. "The letter." It had to be the letter. Miller ripped open Keller's coat and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. The camp seemed to hold its breath as the commandant unfolded it, his eyes scanning the lines. Hale felt his knees weaken. Then Miller did something unexpected. He smiled. Not kindly, never that, but almost wistfully. He turned the paper over, tore off the top where Hale had written the salutation, and handed what remained back to Keller. "It's harmless," he said in German. "A man writes to his woman. Let him believe she will read it. The censors will laugh and throw it away." Keller nodded, relief flickering across his face. The dogs barked, the soldiers moved on, and the storm passed. But Miller's eyes, as he looked toward the barracks, found Hale's through the crack in the boards. For an instant, the two men stared at each other across the gulf of wire and war. Two prisoners of different kinds. Then Miller turned away. Days blurred into each other. The snow melted to mud, then froze again. New prisoners arrived from Italy, thin and bewildered. Rumors spread that the Russians were advancing from the east. The guards grew nervous, crueler. Hale counted time not in days but in dreams. Each night he saw Margaret at the garden gate, her hair caught in the wind, the letter in her hands. He could never see her face when she read it. He always woke before that. Then one gray morning, the impossible happened. A truck rolled through the gates carrying mail bags marked with British insignia. The Red Cross liaison, a Swiss officer named Captain Behrens, supervised the exchange. Hale's heart thudded as he recognized Keller among the soldiers unloading the sacks. The guard's limp was worse, his face pale. As he passed, Keller glanced briefly at Hale and, without slowing, dropped something into the snow near the work detail. A folded piece of paper, slightly damp, stamped with a censor's seal. Hale's breath caught. He waited until the guards moved on, then stooped as if tying his boot and scooped it up. It was his own handwriting, but beneath it, new marks. German signatures, red pencil, the faint impression of an eagle and swastika. And at the bottom, an English postmark dated 3 weeks earlier. It had gone through. It had truly gone through. He stared until his vision blurred. The letter he'd written in secret, under threat of death, had traveled across battle lines and bureaucracy to reach the woman he loved. Somewhere, Margaret had held this same piece of paper, traced the same words with her fingertips. Somehow the system built to erase voices had let one slip through. That night Hale shared a crust of bread with Nowak and told him everything. The Pole listened silently, then said, "Maybe God looks away sometimes, so men can do what he cannot." By mid-February 1944, the winter at Stalag VIIIC had turned into a thing of legend among the prisoners. The men said even the crows had abandoned the skies because there was nothing left alive to feed on. Every sound carried: boots on frozen ground, the brittle cough of someone too weak to stand, the creak of the sentry tower as it swayed against the wind. Life in the camp had compressed into routine and routine into endurance. But beneath the dull rhythm of survival, something new had begun to stir, a fragile current of hope, born from a single impossible rumor. They said a letter had reached England, a real letter smuggled from this very camp. It was being whispered in the washhouse, passed in code between barracks, murmured in the dark after lights out. Some said the man who wrote it was a Scot. Others claimed he was a pilot. The truth bent itself to fit the hunger of men who needed to believe that words could still travel farther than their bodies could. For most, it was just a story to fight the cold with. For Corporal Thomas Hale, it was a secret he carried like a burning coal against his heart. He didn't tell anyone what had happened with Keller, or how the letter had found its way through the censors, but he could feel its ripple across the camp. Men began asking him about the post system, about Red Cross channels, about what kind of ink might not fade on damp paper. Each question was another spark in the darkness. The Germans, sensing the shift, grew tense. Orders came down from Berlin: increased vigilance, inspection of outgoing correspondence, confiscation of unauthorized materials. The censors at Görlitz were warned that subversive morale propaganda could be hidden in emotional correspondence. But by then it was too late. The letter had already become something larger than ink and paper. It was a legend walking among men who had forgotten how to hope. The next time Hale saw Keller, it was in the supply yard beneath a sky the color of wet iron. The guard's limp was worse, and his uniform hung loosely, his belt notched tighter to fit a shrinking frame. He smoked without pause, eyes darting toward the watchtower as though even his habit might betray him. "You were lucky," Keller muttered, handing Hale a tin of frozen soup. They opened it, read it, and maybe they were tired. Maybe they wanted to believe someone could still love in this place. Hale nodded, his throat dry. "Why did you help me?" The German stared at the horizon where smoke from the furnaces blurred into cloud. "Because I remember writing letters too," he said. "And because—" He hesitated, then tapped his temple with a gloved finger. "If we stop remembering we are men, we become what they want us to be." He didn't say who they were. He didn't have to. That night, Hale dreamed of Dorset again, of the lane behind the church, the echo of bicycles against stone walls, the way Margaret used to leave the porch light burning until he came home. In the dream, he saw her unfolding his letter by candlelight, her hands trembling. She smiled, and then the light went out, swallowed by darkness. He woke to shouting. A fight had broken out between guards and prisoners in the barracks across the yard. A man had been caught hoarding bread. The punishment was swift and public. The next morning, Hale saw the man's body tied to the fence as a warning. Snow had crusted over his face. The camp returned to silence, the kind that makes the heart forget its rhythm. Yet somehow that silence carried Hale's thoughts home. He imagined Margaret walking to the post office, the letter in her hand. Perhaps she'd shown it to someone, to the vicar, or to her sister, or to the other wives waiting for news. Perhaps word had reached the War Office or the BBC, or some censor in London who stared at the paper as Muller had, unable to decide whether to destroy or preserve it. The letter had crossed a continent under guns and bombs. Somewhere out there, men in offices were now reading his words and feeling, for the briefest moment, the pulse of something ungovernable: truth. Spring came like an afterthought, thin and reluctant. The snow retreated into puddles, leaving behind mud that swallowed boots and secrets alike. Prisoners were moved between camps. New ones arrived, their faces gaunt and eyes wide with disbelief. Among them were airmen from the RAF's 617 Squadron, shot down over the Ruhr. One of them, Flight Lieutenant Peter Webb, shared Hale's barrack. Webb was tall, sharp-eyed, and restless, the kind of man who could never accept captivity as permanent. He had heard about the letter. Everyone had. You really wrote it? Webb asked one night, voice low. And they let it through? I wrote it, Hale said. But I didn't expect it to reach anyone. Webb grinned. Then maybe you should try again. Hale shook his head. Once was a miracle. Twice would be suicide. But Webb was not the kind to let miracles rest. Over the next weeks, he organized what he called Operation Candlelight, a plan to smuggle coded messages inside official Red Cross mail. The idea was simple. Use ordinary domestic phrases as ciphers. The garden is doing well meant no parcels received. The dog is restless meant morale low. We are expecting visitors meant inspection imminent. Hale helped him refine the system, using his post office experience to mimic the flow of civilian letters. They tested it carefully, slipping a single coded note into the next batch of correspondence. If it vanished, they would stop. If it survived, well, then the world outside would know that Stalag VIIIC still had voices left in it. Weeks passed with no word. Then one morning during roll call, a sergeant from the Censors office entered the yard with a list of names. Hale felt his stomach knot as he heard his number, 4346. He was ordered to report to the Lagerkommandantur at once. The office smelled of tobacco and paper. Behind a desk sat Hauptmann Muller, his uniform immaculate, his expression unreadable. On the desk lay a stack of opened letters, each bearing the crimson stamp of the Abwehrstelle, the German military intelligence office. Muller gestured for Hale to sit. You are an interesting man, Corporal, he began in careful English. You write like a poet. Most men here only ask for food or socks. You write about the moon. Hale said nothing. Muller lifted one of the letters, Webb's coded note. Do you know this handwriting? I don't, sir. Of course not. Muller studied the page, then sighed. The world is losing its mind, Hale. Your side drops bombs on cities. My side builds camps, and yet, a letter like yours slips through and reminds everyone that there are still hearts beating under the uniforms. He leaned forward. Do you know why your letter was allowed to pass? Hale met his gaze. Because someone wanted to believe in it. Muller smiled faintly. No, because someone wanted London to read it. He tapped his temple. Propaganda, Hale. They think showing mercy makes them strong. They don't realize mercy cannot be shown. It must be felt. The officer stood, straightened his belt, and nodded toward the door. You may go. But remember this, words are more dangerous than bullets. Be careful where you fire them. Outside, the air felt thinner, as though he'd stepped from one world into another. Webb waited by the gate, eyes sharp with curiosity. Hale only said, they read it, and they understood. By the summer of 1944, the war had shifted like a tide. Allied bombers thundered overhead daily, shaking the barrack roofs. From the east came the distant growl of artillery, Russian guns inching closer each week. The guards no longer barked orders with conviction. Keller's uniform was frayed. His hands shook when he lit his cigarettes. One evening, as Hale helped distribute parcels, Keller slipped him a small envelope. Inside was a piece of paper torn from a German dispatch form. Written on it in careful script were 6 words. Your letter is on the radio. For a long moment, Hale didn't understand. Then it struck him. The BBC had read it. His letter, the one written on a scrap of Red Cross paper in secret by candlelight, had reached London and been broadcast to the world. Somewhere across the channel, voices spoke his words aloud. Margaret might have heard them. Strangers might have cried. And the Germans who had let it slip through now realized what they'd done. That night, searchlights scoured the camp until dawn. Orders were shouted, files burned, radios confiscated. The commandant's office stayed lit until morning. Rumors spread that the Wehrmacht had demanded an inquiry, who had allowed the letter to pass and why. Keller vanished for 3 days. When he returned, his face was bruised. "They wanted a confession," he said simply. "I told them I cannot read English." Hale pressed a crust of bread into his hand. "You saved me." The German shook his head. "No, Hale, you saved all of us." For a moment we remembered there is still light somewhere. Outside, the guns from the Eastern Front rumbled like a storm rolling closer. As the weeks bled into August, the camp transformed. Prisoners talked openly of liberation. Guards whispered about evacuation. The commandant grew paranoid, ordering trenches dug around the perimeter. For defense, Hale and Nowak worked side by side, shoveling dirt under the relentless sun. The air smelled of sap and diesel. Keller watched from a distance, a ghost in a tattered uniform. One afternoon, while clearing debris near the tool shed, Hale found a half-burned folder among the ashes, censor reports, half in German, half in English. One page singed at the edges bore his name. He read the translation aloud to Nowak. Subject: POW Hale, Thomas, number 4346. Correspondence intercepted. Emotional content considered harmless. Passed through with minor redaction. Later discovered to have been broadcast by British radio. Censor office expresses concern over oversight. Recommendation: monitor subject closely. He stared at the paper until the words blurred. He wasn't a man anymore, he was a file. A clerical mistake turned human, and yet that mistake had carried his heart across a war. When night fell, Hale stood by the wire fence, looking toward the black horizon. The searchlight swung lazily now. The guards barely pretended to watch. Somewhere beyond the trees, the thunder of artillery rolled like the sound of waves. He thought of Margaret, of England, of the letter now immortalized in the ether of radio waves. Proof that love, once spoken, could never be recalled. He whispered the last line again. The world can't stay this cruel forever. The wind carried it into the dark. The thunder that rolled across the Silesian plains in September 1944 was not weather. It was the Red Army. The men at Stalag VIIIC felt it first through the soles of their boots, deep, patient tremors that seemed to rise out of the frozen earth itself. The guards said it was only distant quarry work. The prisoners knew better. Each concussion sounded closer than the last, as if the horizon were slowly tearing open. By then, the camp had aged a lifetime since the letter escaped. The barracks leaned on their foundations. Roofs sagged under the weight of rain. Lice lived where hope once did. But change, that impossible rumor, had finally come. Prisoners watched trains on the far tracks heading west, flatbeds stacked with civilians, Wehrmacht units retreating, smoke staining the sky. Somewhere out there, the map was redrawing itself. Inside Block 12, Hale and Nowak played their nightly game of silence. Who could listen longer to the shelling before admitting it made their hearts race? Keller had stopped smoking. His hands shook too much to hold the matches. "They are coming," he whispered once, staring east through the cracks in the wall. "If the Russians reach us first, we die. If the SS evacuates us, we die on the road." He laughed without mirth. Only choice is when. Hale said nothing. He had no words left that could change the world outside the wire. All he had was a second scrap of paper, Margaret's reply. It had arrived through official post in August, astonishingly legitimate, with the Censors' blue triangle stamped in the corner. She had written, "Tom, your words were read on the radio. The whole village heard them. I don't know how to thank the man who let them pass, but please tell him he has given me back my husband. Every night I light a candle for you. Come home to it." He had read it until the paper frayed. Some nights he pressed it to his face, breathing in the faint smell of soap and ink that seemed to carry England itself. In that letter lived everything that kept him upright when others folded. October arrived wet and cruel. The guards' tempers curdled with the weather. Rumors of desertion spread. One morning a sentry post stood empty, only a rifle left propped against the rail. Keller avoided the officers now, working silently in the supply shed. Hale saw him once slip food to a wounded Russian prisoner and knew the gesture was suicide if discovered. Then, without warning, the commandant vanished. Müller was gone, reassigned, transferred, or perhaps fled. In his place came Oberleutnant Hartmann, a man with sharp cheekbones and colder eyes. He carried his authority like a whip, and in his presence even the air seemed to stand to attention. The first thing he did was order the prisoners counted twice daily. The second was to burn the camp's archives. Hale watched smoke pour from the small brick office where his own file once sat. It felt like erasure, proof that none of them had ever existed. Good, Nowak muttered beside him. They cannot chain ghosts, but ghosts still bled. That week, the guards executed 2 men accused of sabotage, French miners who had cut a telephone wire. Their bodies hung at the gate for 3 days. After that, the camp stopped singing, and yet, beneath the fear, something else began to bloom. Defiance. Webb, the RAF flyer, talked openly of escape. He drew maps in the dirt with a nail, showing routes toward the Oder and the Czech forests. Hale wanted to believe him, but he had seen too much to gamble on miracles twice. Still, each night the men huddled around Webb's sketches, whispering of rivers, bridges, moonlight. It was less a plan than a prayer shaped into geography. In late November, the first snow returned. Wet, heavy, relentless. The front was less than 100 miles away. Artillery flashes stained the clouds at night, red veins pulsing on the horizon. Hartmann ordered preparations for evacuation. The prisoners will march west, he told his officers. Those unable to walk will be left behind. The meaning was clear. Those left behind would not live to see dawn. That evening, Keller came to Hale's barrack under cover of darkness. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. In his coat, he carried a bundle wrapped in cloth, a German field map, a compass, and a small tin of morphine ampules. You may need these, he said. When they march you out, go east, not west. The Russians are near Glogau. The west is only hunger. Hale stared at the items. Why are you helping me again? Keller hesitated. Because I once believed in something called Germany, he said quietly. Now I believe only in people. He pressed the compass into Hale's palm. If you live, tell them not all of us were the same. A shout cracked the night. Keller flinched, vanished into the dark, and Hale never saw him again. The march began 3 weeks later in January 1945, under a sky white with snow and ash. The men were given half rations, a blanket, and orders to move. Columns of POWs stretched for miles across the Silesian countryside, thousands of them from Stalag VIIIC and the surrounding camps. Guards trudged alongside, rifles slung low, eyes vacant. Some prisoners carried the sick on sleds fashioned from doors. Others simply fell and did not rise again. For Hale, each step was a memory peeling away. Dorset. The letter. The voice on the radio, all distant now, replaced by the rhythm of boots and the rattle of breath. The road to Görlitz was lined with villages reduced to skeletons of wood and brick. Civilians stared from doorways, faces expressionless as the procession of ghosts passed by. Once, a child stepped forward and handed Hale a piece of bread before her mother pulled her back inside. The nights were worse. The snow turned to ice beneath them. The dead froze where they fell. Hale kept Margaret's letter pressed against his chest, the paper stiff with sweat and frost. When Nowak stumbled, Hale dragged him by the collar until they reached a barn where other prisoners huddled. Webb was there too, his pilot's arrogance burned down to embers. This is it, he whispered. The empire of silence you wrote about. Only difference is we can still walk. Somewhere behind them, artillery growled again, closer this time. The guards whispered of Russian tanks crossing the Oder. Fear ran both ways now. One morning, as the column crossed a narrow bridge near Sagan, fighter planes appeared out of the cloud. No one knew whose they were. The guards screamed, the prisoners scattered. Bullets chewed the planks, bodies fell into the river. Hale dove into the snow. The air filled with the metallic taste of cordite. When it was over, the bridge was gone. Half the column vanished with it. The survivors crawled to the opposite bank. In the confusion, Webb found Hale. His eyes were wild, his face streaked with soot. Now, he shouted. This is our chance. They ran, through woods, through ditches, through the howling emptiness of a dying front. For 3 days they moved east by night, following Keller's compass and the rumble of distant guns. They ate snow, chewed bark, prayed the cold would make them invisible. On the 4th day, Nowak could go no farther. He sat down beneath a pine and smiled faintly. "Tell your Maggie I had good company," he said. Hale pressed the morphine ampule into his hand and walked on. By the 5th day, the sky had turned a strange bruised color, smoke and sunrise tangled together. The ground shook again, heavier now, rhythmic. Tanks. He crawled to the ridge and saw them, columns of T-34s, their red stars half buried in snow, grinding westward. Soviet infantry followed, faces hard, rifles slung. Liberation had come, not gentle, not clean, but real. A soldier spotted him, raised his weapon, shouted in Russian. Hale lifted his hands, the scrap of Margaret's letter fluttering between his fingers. The soldier hesitated, then lowered the rifle. 2 medics carried Hale toward a truck, wrapping him in blankets that smelled of smoke and vodka. As the engine started, he looked back once at the forest. Snow fell over the tracks they'd left, covering everything. Weeks later, in a hospital near Krakow, Hale awoke to the sound of typewriters and radio static. Allied officers moved between beds, recording names, verifying survivors. A nurse handed him a bowl of broth and asked his name. When he told her, she smiled gently. "Ah," she said in halting English. "The man with the letter." She reached into her apron and produced a folded newspaper. The Times, dated March 1945. On the front page, beneath headlines about the Yalta Conference, was a column titled "The POW Letter That Crossed the Wire." He read it slowly, lips moving over his own words reprinted in perfect type. "Inside these fences we are still men. We have not forgotten how to love." For the first time, he allowed himself to cry. Not for the dead, not for the pain, but for the fact that words had survived where bodies had not. When he finally returned to England months later, Margaret met him at the train station in a coat the color of dusk. She held the original letter in her hands, edges worn soft from rereading. He touched it like one touches a relic, knowing it had traveled farther than any soldier ever could. Behind him, the station loudspeaker crackled with announcements. Ahead, sunlight spilled through the archway onto cobblestones wet with rain. He stepped into it, the sound of trains fading, the world at last exhaling. When Thomas Hale stepped off the train at Paddington Station, England smelled wrong. It smelled of coal smoke, wet stone, and the faint sweetness of victory wrapped in grief. Flags fluttered from soot-black buildings, but the faces beneath them were gray, hollowed by 6 years of war. The crowd cheered, but quietly, as if afraid of being overheard by ghosts. Hale moved through them like a man walking inside a dream, his uniform threadbare, his boots still caked with Polish mud. Each sound, each scent, each light felt foreign, too clean. Freedom was supposed to feel weightless. Instead, it pressed on him like another kind of cage. At the edge of the platform stood Margaret. The candle she had promised to keep burning was gone now, replaced by sunlight that poured through the glass roof in white beams. Her hands trembled when they touched his face. For a long time, neither spoke. The noise of the station receded until only their breathing filled the space between them. Then she whispered, "You came home." He answered softly, "So did your letter." They took the slow train west, past villages half rebuilt, past fields scarred by bomb craters where children now played with tin helmets. Every mile carried him further from the wire, yet part of him remained behind it, the part that still listened for boots on frozen ground. Margaret spoke in fragments, the blackout, the rationing, the night she heard his words on the radio and thought her heart would stop. Hale listened, nodding, but the sound of artillery still echoed faintly in his mind. Even silence had weight now. Back in Dorset, the sea was the same cold gray as before the war. The post office where Hale once worked had been patched with new glass. Inside, the smell of paper and ink nearly broke him. He ran his fingers over the rows of envelopes, the brass scales, the worn counter. "Funny," he murmured to Margaret, "how the world ends and still the mail goes through." That evening, neighbors filled their small cottage with tea and questions. Someone had brought a clipping from the Times, the article with his letter. Others spoke of hearing it broadcast on the BBC, how it had lifted spirits across Britain during the darkest months. To them, Hale was a symbol, a story with a happy ending. They couldn't see the tremor in his hands each time someone mentioned Stalag VIIIC. When the last guest left, he sat by the fire, staring into the coals, until Margaret gently touched his arm. "They only mean to be kind," she said. He nodded, unable to tell her that kindness felt heavier than pity. In the months that followed, he tried to build a life out of fragments. He returned to the post office, sorting letters addressed to other men's homes. Each envelope was a reminder of the one that should never have made it out. Sometimes he thought he saw Keller's face in the crowd outside, the German guard who had risked everything, but it was always a trick of light, a stranger's gait. He learned to smile on cue, to say fine thank you when asked. But at night he woke gasping, his hand clutching for paper that wasn't there. The Ministry of Information invited him to London that autumn to record a broadcast for the BBC Home Service. A short talk, they said, on hope and endurance. He wanted to refuse, but Margaret persuaded him. Maybe if you tell it once, she said, it will stop telling itself inside your head. The studio smelled of dust and hot wires. A producer adjusted his microphone while a young secretary smiled encouragingly from behind the glass. When the light went red, Hale hesitated. He could have repeated the familiar version, the uplifting story, the miracle of the letter that defied censors. Instead, he said quietly, I don't know why they let my words through. Maybe mercy, maybe exhaustion. But I know this, a letter is a fragile thing. It can carry love or truth or both, and sometimes the truth is heavier than any envelope can bear. When the recording ended, no one spoke for several seconds. The producer finally said, that will do nicely. The broadcast went out 2 nights later. Letters poured in, hundreds from listeners who had lost sons, husbands, brothers. They wrote to thank him for reminding them that the human voice could survive anything. Hale read each one carefully, answering what he could, filing the rest in a shoebox beneath the bed. The irony was not lost on him. After a war fought over words and silence, he had become a postman again. Winter 1946 brought snow like the old winters in Silesia. The sight of it made him shiver. One evening, while clearing the hearth, he found the original letter where Margaret had hidden it, in a tin marked Tea Ration 1942. The paper was brittle. The ink faded, but his handwriting was unmistakable. He held it to the firelight and read aloud until his voice broke. Margaret knelt beside him. It's just words, Tom, she whispered. He shook his head. No, it's a map. It took me home. That night he wrote again for the first time in years, not to her, but to anyone who might someday read it. He described the camp, the faces, the smell of smoke and cabbage, the sound of Keller's laughter when the world was still burning. He ended with a single line. A letter can survive even when men cannot. He folded the page and placed it beside the original, 2 ghosts resting together. In the spring of 1947, a visitor arrived unannounced, a man in a worn brown coat carrying a cane. His accent was German. When Hale opened the door, the man removed his hat and said softly, Thomas Hale. It took Hale a moment to recognize him. The limp, the eyes. Keller. They stood for a long moment, silent except for the wind off the channel. Keller's face was older, his hair gone thin. I was a prisoner too, he said. After the surrender. They sent me to Wales to clear mines. They call it rehabilitation. I call it penance. He reached into his coat and handed Hale a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a fountain pen, its barrel cracked but still gleaming. You forgot this, Keller said. From the barrack wall. I kept it, Hale swallowed hard. You could have destroyed it. Keller smiled faintly. Some things must survive or none of us will. He turned to leave, but Hale stopped him. Stay for tea, he said. Keller hesitated, then nodded. For an hour they sat in awkward peace, 2 men bound by a single act of defiance that had outlived the empire that tried to erase it. When Keller finally left, Hale watched him disappear down the lane until fog swallowed him whole. In the years that followed, the story of the letter became history. Documentaries quoted it. Schools printed it in textbooks as proof of the resilience of the human spirit. But for Hale, it was never a story. It was a scar. Each anniversary brought journalists to his door asking the same questions, chasing the same miracle. He answered politely, but inside he carried another truth. That survival was quieter, lonelier, and far less cinematic than anyone wanted to hear. By 1950, the nightmares had begun to fade. He and Margaret had a son, David, who grew up never knowing the smell of fear. On his 12th birthday, Hale took him to the sea and showed him how to fold a letter so it wouldn't tear in the rain. Why do you care so much about letters, Dad? The boy asked. Hale smiled, the wind whipping his hair. Because they're small miracles, he said. They travel through fire and still arrive. In 1963, Long after the world had moved on to new wars and new letters, the BBC rebroadcast the original recording of his voice. Hale listened alone in the kitchen, the wireless crackling softly. The words sounded strange now, youthful, unscarred, like someone he used to know. When it ended, he turned the dial off and stared out the window where rain streaked the glass. He thought of Keller again, wondered where he had gone, if he still walked with that same limp along some German street lined with rebuilding houses. Margaret entered quietly, a cup of tea in hand. "You should be proud," she said. He nodded, but his voice was distant. "I am, but I keep thinking, it wasn't the letter that mattered. It was the space between the lines. That's where we all lived." When Hale died in 1972, the letter was found folded beneath his pillow, alongside the cracked fountain pen. The paper had yellowed, but the ink remained legible, the words steady as if written yesterday. Margaret donated both to the Imperial War Museum, where they were displayed under glass in a dimly lit room. Visitors leaned close to read the faded script. "Inside these fences we are still men. We have not forgotten how to love." Beneath it, a small plaque read, "Recovered from Stalag VIIIC, Görlitz, 1944. Donated 1973. Children pressed their faces to the glass. Veterans stood silently, remembering their own letters that never made it home. The museum's curator once said that among all the relics, the helmets, the medals, the weapons, none drew more tears than that single sheet of paper, because everyone who read it felt the same shiver of impossible truth, that words written in despair can outlive the hands that wrote them, that mercy can hide inside the enemy's pocket, and that sometimes history's most dangerous weapon is hope written in pencil. The rain had stopped over London, leaving the city slick with reflections of light. In the archives of the Imperial War Museum, a young curator named Eleanor Pierce unlocked the preservation vault. It was 1995, the 50th anniversary of the war's end. The museum planned a new exhibit, Voices of the Silenced, and she'd been assigned to restore one of its most fragile artifacts, the letter from Stalag VIIIC. The envelope lay inside a glass sleeve, its edges browned, the ink feathered by time. Even after half a century, the handwriting looked alive, as though the pencil might still be warm from a hand desperate to be heard. Eleanor adjusted her magnifying lens and began reading. Halfway down the page, her breath caught. "We will come home, Maggie. The world can't stay this cruel forever." The words were simple, but they carried a pulse, as if the man who'd written them had hidden his heartbeat in every loop of the letters. She'd read hundreds of wartime correspondences, but none felt like this. Most were official, censored, sanitized. This one was raw, unfiltered, impossible. Eleanor checked the file notes. Interception date, 14 Feb 1944. Passed unedited through Görlitz Censor Division. Reason unknown. A penciled addendum barely legible added, "Reviewed by Oberkommando. Retained for morale use." She frowned. What morale? For whom? Something in the phrasing didn't fit the bureaucratic style of Nazi correspondence. It sounded conflicted, human. She opened the secondary folder. Inside were declassified transcripts, letters from British and German censors, their handwriting looping across onion skin paper. One name appeared several times, Lieutenant Karl Keller. Her pulse quickened. The same Keller who had risked everything for the letter? But the note described him as translator and morale officer, assigned to the Görlitz field office. There it was. His signature, beneath a line written in German, "Let this one through. It does no harm to tell the truth once." Eleanor sat back in silence, feeling the weight of 50 years collapse into the small space between the desk lamp and the letter. For decades, people had wondered how Hale's words escaped the censors. Some called it luck, others divine intervention. But here, in the fine print of forgotten paperwork, was the truth. Mercy, written by a man on the wrong side of the wire. The guard and the prisoner bound by the same defiance. She typed a new label for the exhibit, her fingers trembling. Approved for transmission by Lieutenant Karl Keller, Görlitz, 1944. When the exhibit opened, people came in waves. Veterans in wheelchairs, schoolchildren clutching field trip worksheets, widows carrying photographs. They stood before the glass case and read Hale's words aloud, their voices soft as prayer. Some left flowers, others left silence. Among the visitors was a man in his 50s with sea-gray eyes and the steady posture of someone used to standing at attention. His name tag read David Hale. He was Thomas and Margaret's son, now older than his father had ever lived to be. He had grown up with the letter as bedtime story, myth, legend. But standing there watching strangers weep over his father's handwriting, he realized he had never truly read it. Not with the eyes of a man who understood what it cost to write. Eleanor approached quietly. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I'm the curator. There's something you should see." She led him to a side office where a small file lay open. Inside was the document she'd found, the one with Keller's signature. She pointed to it gently. "Your father's letter passed because of this man." David read the line slowly, lips moving. "Let this one through. It does no harm to tell the truth once." He exhaled, the sound breaking halfway. "My father used to talk about him," he said. "He never called him an enemy." Eleanor nodded. "We're adding his name to the exhibit. Both of them deserve to stand together." For a long moment they stood in silence, two generations bound by ink and forgiveness. That night, David walked through London until the rain began again. The city was bright now. New glass, new wars on the television screens and shop windows. But beneath the progress, he felt the same old ache his father must have felt. How easily people forget that mercy can exist in the unlikeliest places. He stopped by the Thames, where the river glimmered under the bridges, and took from his coat pocket a folded page, his father's final note. The one Margaret had preserved but never shared publicly. The ink had faded to brown, but the words remained. "If we stop remembering we are men, we become what they wanted. But if we write, even once, we stay human forever." David refolded the page and whispered, "Then we keep writing." He went home and wrote to Keller's last known address in Bavaria, found through an old veterans registry. The envelope returned 3 weeks later, stamped unzustellbar, Empfänger verstorben, undeliverable, recipient deceased. Still, the act mattered. The letter had gone as far as it could, just like the first one. 20 years passed. The century turned. The old wars faded into documentaries and commemorations. But the letter never stopped traveling. It appeared in textbooks, in museum catalogs, in university lectures about censorship and the power of empathy in conflict. In 2010, a filmmaker uncovered Eleanor's research and created a documentary titled "The Letter That Outlived the War." It opened with Hale's words, read in his original Dorset accent, recorded by the BBC in 1946. Over grainy footage of Stalag VIIIC, the narrator said, "One man wrote a letter to his wife. Another man, sworn to silence, chose not to destroy it. Together they changed the meaning of victory." The film went on to win international awards. Yet the moment that silenced every cinema came near the end, when the camera panned across the original letter in its glass case, the reflection of visitors shimmering like ghosts over the paper. The narrator whispered, "It is easy to remember the wars we fought. Harder to remember the moments we chose not to." In 2020, on the 75th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day, the museum reopened after restoration. The curator who cut the ribbon was Eleanor's apprentice, a young historian named Lena Hartmann, Keller's granddaughter. She had discovered her family connection only years earlier, after finding her grandfather's service papers. When she learned what he had done, she crossed the channel to dedicate her career to preserving voices silenced by war. Her speech that morning was simple. My grandfather was a German censor. But one day he decided not to censor a letter. That decision, more than any order or uniform, defined who he really was. History is not built by nations, it's built by moments of mercy. The crowd applauded quietly. In the front row sat David Hale, now white-haired, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers from Dorset. When the ceremony ended, Lena joined him by the glass case. Together they stood before their grandfather's shared act of rebellion, the thin bridge of paper that had spanned half a century, and an ocean of hate. "Do you ever think they knew?" Lena asked. David smiled faintly. "I think they did. Maybe that's why the letter survived. It wasn't just written, it was answered." She nodded. "Then we keep answering." When the museum closed that night, the lights dimmed one by one until only the letter remained lit. Dust motes floated in the air like snow. The glass reflected no faces now, only the faint glow of the paper as if it still breathed. Outside, London's rain began again, soft and steady. the same rhythm that had fallen on Dorset fields and Polish mud all those decades before. Somewhere in the archives, the metal shelves creaked with the settling weight of history, and within that silence, if one listened closely enough, there was the faint sound of a pencil scratching against paper, a memory replaying itself forever. Eleanor Pierce's successor once said in an interview, "Every war museum preserves artifacts of death. This one preserves proof of life." The letter from Stalag VIIIC is not about who won or lost. It's about the single act that refused to obey cruelty. A German officer letting hope pass through his hands. A British prisoner believing it could reach home. That's the closest thing to victory humanity ever achieved. Today, the letter remains sealed behind glass, temperature controlled, ink stabilized, but the story refuses containment. Copies hang in schools, libraries, even military academies. And sometimes, rarely, a visitor will lean close, their breath fogging the glass, and whisper a word of thanks neither Hale nor Keller can hear. But perhaps that's the point, because history is not written by those who shout the loudest. It is written by those who write it all, by those who risk putting love on paper in a world built to burn it.